My phone rang just after midnight. On the line was one of my bleary-eyed colleagues from Facebook. They had just been alerted that the US government believed agents working for the Iranian government planned to release a video the following day as part of a campaign to intimidate American voters. We did not know exactly what the video said or showed, but it had something to do with the Proud Boys, a street fighting group whose leadership was ultimately imprisoned for their actions around January 6th. It was October 2020, weeks before the election. I remember slumping down onto the hardwood floor in my pajamas so we could talk through our options. Sure enough, early the following day, an erratically edited video with a soundtrack from Metallica was released online. The video claimed that it had been made by the Proud Boys. It claimed the group had stolen voter rolls and would target Democrats. It seemed designed to intimidate Democratic voters, but it was so sloppily crafted that some thought it might be designed to boost Democratic turnout and embarrass Republicans. I'm not going to speculate about the partisan motives, and I have that luxury because this video ultimately had very little impact. Alert to the possibility of such a video, Facebook removed copies extremely quickly, and the campaign quickly withered. In short, this was a win for Americans generally, for democracy more broadly, and for Facebook. The question today is, why was Facebook able to act so quickly and thereby so meaningfully in disrupting this operation? Was it because the government had given us a tip and we took their word that this was a nation-state influence operation? No. Facebook did not rely on government assertions, even by the United States, to make such decisions during my tenure, and I doubt they would today. Was it because we could verify that it was an Iranian influence operation? No. Ultimately, Facebook did corroborate that Iranian-linked accounts pushed this campaign. But that kind of analysis takes time. That's not what allowed us to act so quickly and effectively. This particular foreign disinformation campaign was removed not because it was a foreign disinformation campaign, or because it aimed to intimidate voters, or even because it violated Facebook's policies requiring people to use their real names and identities. It was removed because 2 years beforehand, Facebook had designated the Proud Boys as a hate group. In the nomenclature of the policy at the time, that meant praise, support, and most importantly for this discussion, representation of the Proud Boys was not allowed on the platform. When the Iranian propagandists decided to impersonate the Proud Boys, they inadvertently ensured that their propaganda violated one of Facebook's broadest and most easily implemented policies. Facebook's dangerous organizations policy was built to easily enable the removal of mass-distributed content attributed to a designated group, and that allowed it to play a decisive role in this case. It was decisive not just because the fact pattern fit the policy, but also because that determination could be made quickly. And once that determination was made, it could easily be applied at the scale of the disinformation campaign. So is this all just a good news story? Of course not. The great challenge, of course, is that a policy broad enough to inadvertently apply to a disinformation campaign it was not designed for is probably broad enough to inadvertently apply in other circumstances it was not designed for, where a speaker's intent is not as clearly nefarious. And because that broad policy decision can be made quickly, individual applications of the policy may not be scrutinized. And of course, because a single determination may then be scaled, the impact of an unfortunate decision, whether at the policy or the operational level, can have a far broader impact. I think about this as sort of the Shakespearean principle of community standards and trust and safety more generally, which is that a policy's greatest strength is also its tragic flaw. My name is Brian Fishman, and it is a great honor for me to be here with you. I used to lead the work on dangerous organizations at Facebook, as Stuart said. I actually had business cards that read Head of Dangerous Organizations, which is a title that I will probably never better. Today, I'm a co-founder of Cinder, a software company that builds operational tools for platform governance, which our clients use to manage their trust and safety challenges, and both train and monitor AI systems. Long ago, I led research at the US Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center. We have come incredibly far as a community since 2005, when my colleagues at the CTC and I were stumbling around the internet in search of information generated by Al-Qaeda and its supporters. At the time, our work gathering data on jihadi web forums was considered cutting edge, both by academics and various intelligence agencies, which, with some notable exceptions, tended at the time to discount open source information gathering. By contemporary standards, however, our methods were rudimentary. They were not systematic, rarely quantitative, and with a couple of exceptions, seldom took advantage of contemporary investigative techniques to track users across various platforms. At CTC, we weren't the first, nor were we the only ones struggling to crawl out of the primordial muck to understand violent extremism online. The Anti-Defamation League semi-systematically tracked American white supremacists on the nascent internet in the early 1980s. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center campaigned to drive white supremacists off Beverly Hills Internet, a precursor to GeoCities, the early website building platform. That was in the mid-90s. Note, if you look up there, that Stormfront immediately sought hosting on servers and locales it deemed more friendly in Russia and Florida, which I think is funny. Despite these efforts, GeoCities was used by jihadi groups as well, including Jund al-Islam, a Kurdish jihadi group that became part of the justification for the invasion of Iraq. After 9/11, much of the energy to research terrorism online focused on Al-Qaeda, its cousins, and its offshoots, including the folks that eventually created the so-called Islamic State. Unsurprisingly, that was our focus at West Point in the mid-2000s. The geopolitical environment then shaped how the media and civil society approached terrorism online as well. If anyone's looking for a dissertation topic, please test the veracity of this multi-part and almost completely anecdotal observation. Media coverage of extremism online in the mid-2000s was written by national security reporters primarily. It was a function of the post-9/11 wars and framed in those terms. That dynamic persisted through the early years of social media. National security professionals had tried vainly for a long time to get social media companies to care about Al-Qaeda and others increasingly operating not just online, but on their platforms. While working at New America, a think tank in DC, in 2010, I helped organize the meeting where the National Counterterrorism Center first presented what they called their community awareness brief about Anwar al-Awlaki, an American member of Al-Qaeda, to social media companies. The platforms were not particularly motivated to do much about it at the time. But when those national security professionals turned to the media to try to raise this issue, who did they turn to? Not the technology reporters in Silicon Valley that the technology companies actually cared about and listened to. Rather, they turned to national security reporters in Washington and New York. It was not until years later, when technology reporters were confronted directly by so-called Islamic State propaganda on Twitter, that they began to cover these issues aggressively. And their coverage was a bit different than the national security reporters. Instead of framing the issues in terms of the battlefield dynamics in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were motivated more by the business of Silicon Valley and tended to see the technology itself as a core driver of events. I suspect that this shift had some benefits. For example, technology desks were more open to a broader conception of what sort of extremists deserved coverage. They were not bound to national security issues in the most traditional sense and saw the parallels between Nazis, the original digital violent extremists, and the violent jihadist groups. But there was a cost to this shift as well. The perpetual journalistic need to describe newsworthy phenomena as new phenomena was coupled with the bias of technology desks to see technology as a core driver of events. This often meant that complex violent movements were detached from their social and political context. The long history of digital extremism was largely ignored. and the manifestation of these groups online was presented as functions primarily of the technology itself, which by then meant social media. Clearly, social media is useful to terrorist groups. I know better than most that recommendation algorithms can help violent extremists build, and after networks are disrupted, rebuild networks online. Nonetheless, the tech media's tendency to frame the phenomena as new detached it from the social, ideological, and organizational mechanisms that have spawned terrorism for years and obscured the reality that violent extremists have used digital platforms, not just social media, from almost their inception. In some cases, this focus has been deleterious to building a sense of responsibility among platforms. For example, Substack's founder justified their lack of a crackdown on neo-Nazis by indicating that they did not use recommendation algorithms and ads, features that they called the internet's original sin. In my view, the internet's true original sin is the naive belief among some in Silicon Valley that they have no responsibility to mitigate the risks associated with technological progress. All that said, we are better off today than in the past. The work done by a whole host of people to understand terrorism online is so much more sophisticated and rigorous than our work back in the mid-2000s. We've come a long way in 20 years. Still, one of the things that we got right at West Point 20 years ago was to embrace the dynamism of what we were studying. We were deeply opposed at the time to the idea that anyone could be an expert on terrorist use of the internet. We talked about it a lot. This was a multifaceted idea. On the one hand, we had the idea that the groups we studied, the geopolitical context in which they operated, and the technologies they used were changing so quickly that expertise on the phenomenon was impossible. Despite the knowledge collected in this room, I still like this idea. It fosters humility and audacity, both qualities necessary to counter the adversarial and adaptive people, organizations, and ideologies we are here to discuss. On the one hand, the impossibility of expertise suggests that any knowledge you generate is partial and will probably soon be outdated. So you have to be open to challenges to your conclusions and processes. Humility. On the other hand, it suggests that established institutions and leaders in the field are also chasing a dynamic reality. So why can't you be the one to innovate the next big idea? Audacity. That's why I look at this august group and say with genuine admiration, and at the risk of insulting everyone here, that we are in a room full of incredibly knowledgeable people, but without any experts. The reason is that you've all had the audacity, humility, sense of civic responsibility, and barefoot ragamuffin irreverence for what has come before to study and build systems to counter dynamic problems that preclude both expertise and clear solutions. In this dynamic environment, we are all students and can use that ethos to celebrate our wins, examine and learn from our failings, and bolster the audacity we will need to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday. When it comes to companies dealing with trust and safety challenges generally, and violent extremism specifically, I see three great shifts happening today. First, many platforms are embracing trust and safety earlier in their life cycle than in the past. This trend is not universal. Many of those early trust and safety efforts are minimal and they are error-prone. Moreover, starting early does not necessarily translate into systematic programs that grow with a platform and the risk it accrues over time. Nonetheless, I think there is a greater awareness among founders that they must attend to these issues. Indeed, the mere fact that companies like mine, like Cinder, have been funded by venture capitalist firms is evidence that the broader startup ecosystem is increasingly aware of trust and safety and its importance. That said, it's important to keep in mind that young companies face intense resource constraints, struggling just to keep the lights on. Those that do commit to trust and safety often pay vendors for API-based classification services and then rely on those third-party labels to drive their decisions. Effectively, this means they are outsourcing their policies because those classifiers were trained on third-party policy definitions, not platform-specific ones. The second trend is the AI explosion. This is a list of various AI companies. Advances in LLMs and AI systems more generally mean companies can more easily instruct classifiers to apply platform-specific policies, which will alleviate to some extent the third-party classifier problem I just mentioned. In general, the ability to train AI systems more quickly and more cheaply will empower platforms to keep up with emergent and evolving threats. I envision a future where human reviewers increasingly monitor and benchmark first-tier decisions made by automated systems and review a fewer number of complex or borderline cases. This trend is not exactly new. 5 years ago at Facebook, AI systems regularly scored more accurately than human reviewers, though they were, and are, prone to strange, inexplicable mistakes that a human being would likely avoid. But we should be careful not to fetishize human review. At scale, human review teams have predictable error rates. Human beings all bring their own biases, and those biases can matter a great deal when reviewing for potential terrorist content. Early in my tenure at Facebook, we discovered that a critical human review team had simply ignored the company's list of formally designated terrorist groups and instead had developed their own. It was a deliberate attempt to circumvent policy. AI will not attempt such deception. But the future of fully automated trust and safety systems will not arrive overnight. Classifiers still struggle to adequately understand highly contextualized language and images. And systems that can reliably understand multimodal content, meaning media and text together, are still very expensive to use at scale. So this transition is going to happen, but at the speed of financial and operational viability, not simply at the speed of the bleeding edge of technology. There's been a lot of chatter about the abuse of AI systems by extremist groups. Of course, this is happening, and it will continue to happen. Violent extremists adopt new technology along with everybody else. I don't need to tell this group that. It's not clear to me, though, that this is going to substantially change the impact of the messaging, with one key exception. AI-driven propaganda is more likely to be covered by mainstream media outlets because it is AI-driven. And that coverage is likely to inadvertently celebrate the technological sophistication of these groups and thereby inadvertently bolster them. I worry about this because I think that the Islamic State's, the so-called Islamic State's early use of Twitter was powerful in large part because it activated unwitting tech journalists to write stories highlighting the technical acumen of the group, not just because of the native reach of the propaganda on Twitter itself. I worry about a similar dynamic today with AI. So what about the AI companies themselves? How are they dealing with these issues? Many of the larger firms are moving aggressively to identify and prevent abuse, even building so-called threat intelligence teams to conduct coordinated takedowns of nefarious actors. These efforts draw on established trust and safety process, but many in the AI community refer to the work as responsible AI, or AI safety, or AI governance. They don't like, in many cases, the term trust and safety. But many of the processes are the same. It's important to remember that the AI space is really bloated, and many of the companies in it are going to die. At the same time, public discourse about AI recognizes and sometimes overstates the risks of this technology. As my co-founder, Glenn Wise, first observed to me, that can produce perverse incentives for AI companies. It's not that they seek a public trust and safety mishap, but abuse of their tools may spur a public discussion about the power of their particular platform, and that may distinguish them in a very crowded field. Moreover, the reputational downsides of such an event are mitigated because, unlike the narratives about specific social media firms, AI mishaps tend to be attributed to the technology as a whole rather than specific platforms. I'd argue that too much of the criticism of social media focused on the decisions and specific features of particular platforms, while ignoring the fundamental risks associated with technology that connects people instantaneously at global scale. With AI, we should watch for the inverse mistake, blaming the technology broadly and ignoring the peculiarities of specific corporate decisions and features. Perhaps, you might think, the third theme I'll mention, regulation, can redress these incentives, and perhaps not. There is no doubt that companies increasingly aim to comply with the Digital Service Act and online harms, among others, but these regulations are no panacea. Overall, I think they will eventually raise the floor for trust and safety investments by companies, while at the same time lowering the ceiling. It will take a while to raise the floor, though. Take the DSA. The very large online platforms have extensive obligations, and some of those companies are likely to receive intense regulatory scrutiny. So far, though, those enforcement efforts have been highly predictable and align with the political vulnerability of the platforms being examined. I'm sure the legal teams at X and Meta were not surprised to find themselves investigated. The thing is, the legal teams at a whole host of smaller platforms were also not surprised to find X and Meta investigated. They can read the room. They understand the politics of regulatory enforcement and the capacity of the regulators. And as a result, they have a calculation to make. Do we invest heavily into DSA compliance now, when we know that our company is unlikely to be subject to enforcement? Or do we spend some of those same resources investing in the next killer feature? Only 24 companies are registered with the EU Statement of Reasons database, and there is a message in that for all of us. As anyone that has written platform policies at a social media firm can attest, policy is near meaningless without a plan to operationalize it. During my tenure at Facebook, I got into a debate with my friend J.M. Berger, who many of you will know, at a workshop. He was arguing that Facebook's policy on white supremacist hate groups was weak compared to its policy regarding Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. I was arguing that Facebook's policies toward these groups were essentially the same, but its operational posture toward the two differed. We were both right, and there was a lesson in that for regulators today. The company did have largely similar policies addressing both hate groups and terrorist organizations. But Facebook also had limited operational resources and needed to develop novel mechanisms to proactively target material from these groups. That meant Facebook had to choose where to focus those resources. At first, we prioritized what we called global terrorist groups, effectively Al-Qaeda, the so-called Islamic State, and the Taliban. It was worth asking some questions about that one. Then we expanded to other terrorist groups, then hate groups, and then large-scale criminal organizations. JM had recognized that enforcement disparity when it existed and interpreted it as a policy difference. In a technical sense, that wasn't correct. But in terms of effective impact, he was making a critical and accurate point. Was Facebook's policy really equal if it wasn't enforced with the same effort and efficacy? Given the constraints, I today would defend the prioritization decisions we made. And as enforcement matured, the overall balance in it improved dramatically. But it's indisputable that prioritization decisions carry costs, including lagging enforcement against a range of really terrible entities and potentially companies that aren't living up to their regulatory obligations. The EU's enforcement focus on VLOPs has consequences as well. Keen general counsels at smaller tech firms will calculate that the risk of enforcement against them is low because of the operational limitations of the EU enforcement mechanism and its focus on VLOPs. And they are investing or not investing accordingly. Another example of regulatory trade-offs. When the European Privacy Directive prohibited automated scanning of private messages for trust and safety violations, for most trust and safety violations, including terrorist content, it was significant because the really, really, really bad stuff happens in private messages. As a general rule, the planning, recruitment, and operationalization of plots to attack churches, mosques, and synagogues and disrupt democratic processes happens in messaging applications. Not on open Facebook pages, not in TikTok videos, private messages. After the EPD, platforms had fewer tools to identify terrorist messaging in those messaging applications, even the unencrypted ones. And regulation was a key reason. Now, it's worth noting that this remains an open debate among regulators. Apparently, the European Council was looking at language yesterday that would require scanning of private messages. Wherever this winds up, there are trade-offs here. And for the time being, savvy terrorists have more safe haven on messaging services and applications than they had in the past. In the past, the responsibility for managing these trade-offs used to belong solely to the platforms, and they had to be accountable for the outcome of those decisions. Today, that responsibility is shared by regulators. And that means that when those trade-offs lead to some negative outcomes, real-world outcomes, we have to make sure that we hold the regulators accountable too, not just reflexively point to the platforms, which I think is a very real risk. Charlotte Wilner at the Trust and Safety Professional Association jokes that trust and safety, TNS, stands for trade-offs and sadness. To all the regulators in the room, I would say, welcome to the club. Look, I'm honored to be here with all of you. A sustained conference series like TASM would have been unthinkable 20 years ago when I started doing this work. And today we have specialists from companies, regulators, academics, and civil society coming together to discuss and debate these issues. It's invigorating. The questions we face are so dynamic that they defy expertise. But those same questions rejoin ancient and perennial debates about privacy and security, unfettered speech and the obligations of community, the universality of morality, and the specificity of language, culture, and tradition. With those stakes, I hope we can all find the humility to be challenged over the next several days and to learn from one another. May we also have the audacity to generate new ideas, to speak up when something demands clarification, and ultimately to build this community stronger. Thank you so much to Stuart, to Swansea, and the entire TASM community for inviting me here today. I'm proud to be part of this group and excited to spend the next few days with you. Thank you very much.